Hey, welcome to the 99, a ministry of Crossroads Grace Community Church in Manteca, California. I'm your host, Heather Mahoney, and at the 99, our goal is to reach our ones far from God by equipping the 99 to follow Jesus more fully. Each week, we take time to lean into the weekend message at Crossroads by expanding further into the topic or concept in greater depth. We hope it challenges you and creates a hunger to dive into scriptures so you can know Jesus better. If you want to best engage with us, make sure to catch this weekend's message at crossroadsgrace.org/series or by downloading the Crossroads app. So great to be back with everyone for our second week of the 99 today. I'm joined by our lead pastor, Brian Hunt. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you. Well, again, can't see you, but glad you're with us today.
Me too. So you kicked off week 2 of Unashamed, a study of the book of Romans. And, you started things off real strong and digging right into, you've bought steak at the Dollar Tree restaurant before. I mean, not restaurant, store, and you ate it?
Yeah, a dollar store restaurant would be really cool. Maybe we could try to do that, but...
I shouldn't have even suggested that. I apologize.
No. Yeah, so I'm the weird guy in my town that walks and reads and does things all the time. I'm actually known as the weird guy that does that now, so shout out Escalon, let's go. But there is this dollar store that I walked by, and sure enough, there was this sign that said, dollar steaks, and I walked by it for, a week straight, and I finally said, I just got to do it. I got to go and get this nasty steak at the dollar store. So it's true. It's very true.
Did out of principle you finish it because you paid for it?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I'm that way. Are you that way? Like if you buy food, do you feel bad not eating it all? Is that your thing?
Usually, except last week, Sean and I had the grossest veggie chips ever, and we threw them away. But normally, we would finish what we bought.
Yeah, I can't do, Cherie's like, oh, I'm just full. I'm like, no, you're not full. We're eating the rest of it. But no, yeah, you ate the whole thing. You just had to, and it was $1, so it wasn't, it was worth every penny, like I said.
It was worth every penny. Okay, then you went on to actually say your favorite steakhouse. Mm-hmm. Is it Smith and Wolinski's?
You said it right. Say it with power, though. Smith and Wolinski's.
Smith and Wolinski's.
So good.
In Chicago, not the one in Las Vegas.
No. Yeah. The Vegas one, decent, but Chicago, overlooking the Chicago River. Oh. My wife and I, we would go there once a year for our anniversary. So I don't want people out there thinking he does it all the time. Because it's expensive, no joke. But unbelievable cocoa coffee rub steak with a filet mignon. It is just
yeah, I looked it up online and it said it was topped with angry onions.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
That's a fancy word for like when you get French onions that you put at Thanksgiving on that
thing. Like crunchy onions.
Crunchy onions, yeah.
Perfect.
And I don't necessarily think they're angry either, but they just they look like a little tuffet on top,
Tuffet.
Like when I used to have hair, like it was a little tuffet, but that's what it was. But it's so good in the sides. We could keep going on, but it's unbelievable. So highly recommend. 10 out of 10. Got to do it.
All right, now let's get into some actual biblical context here. As you wrestled with the second half of Romans 1, what really stuck out to you? Where did you camp out as you studied and dug in deeper?
Well, the problem with this whole series that we're going to find over and over is how do you stop? How do you, there's so much that's there. And yeah, we're doing this over a length of time and a long period of time, but we could just do it for the rest of our lives, right? There's so much that's there. And so with Romans 1, the reason that we broke it out the way that we did is that we had to establish what the gospel was first. And again, shout out to Preston, did a great job. I super appreciate his insight of that. But then after you look at the gospel, then you have to look at the other side of it. There is the gospel and how beautiful that is. But then there's also a side that if you don't accept the gospel, what does that mean? So as you look into Romans 1, if you're looking into the pool of what that is, you have to be able to get both equal opportunity, because if you don't have that, you don't fully get the fullness of God, of who he is. There is the gospel. Yes, he loves you, grace, forgiveness. But then if you don't receive him as Lord and Savior, there is another side that Paul is very clear on describing to us. And that's where I felt like we needed to. Now, I would say some churches don't do that. A lot of churches would probably just pull up and they love the Jesus that's in the manger and the happy Jesus. And that's good, because that's a huge part of God's character. But the wrath of God is real. And we have to look at that, and we have to know that fully so we can know the fullness of his love.
Yeah, big stuff you had to unpack.
Yeah.
Yeah, plenty of information and content for us to dig into this week on the 99. I think that was left. One of the things you said near the top of your message was The wrath of God will only illuminate how amazing Jesus is and why his love for us is better than anything this world has to offer. Maybe you can kind of just unpack that.
Yeah. Well, kind of like what I was alluding to there is that as you look at both God's love,
Yes.
his gospel, his grace, then you have to look at the other side of his wrath. And as you look in the Old Testament, what I love about the Old Testament is it really does, it's not going to sugarcoat it. God's
Hmm.
wrath is there. And there's some really things that make you scratch your head and say, whoa, like he did that. But you always want to make sure that you look at where the wrath was directed towards. And that was directed towards sin and evil and things that were apart that were terrible, terrible things. Like it's just really, really hard to even comprehend that. But what you need to also then consider is that that same sin, that same evil is still in our world, and that wrath is ultimately going to consume that as well, that God would do that. But that's why we need the gospel to be able to have something to get in the way of that wrath. And as I said in the message, that really the Old Testament God in people say, is there an Old Testament God? Is there a New Testament God? But the God is the same, but the wrath that you see in the Old Testament, Jesus comes into the picture and he becomes like the dam that holds back that wrath of God's wrath
Hmm.
for a period of time so that we can receive the gift that Jesus has given us. So that when Jesus comes back and God is going to make all things new, Jesus is going to remove that dam of God's wrath that's going to fall on creation and on
Yeah.
all of us that don't know who Christ is as Lord and Savior. But for those of us that do, we'll be on the right side of that wrath because it
Hmm.
will ultimately be victory for us and justice will come, and that comes only in the form of Jesus. So to your point, like we have to understand both sides of that. The wrath of God will ultimately show us how amazing Jesus is, because when you consider how forceful God's wrath is, then to
Yes.
counterbalance that with the magnitude of God's love through Jesus just makes your mind just kind of blow up. It just blows your mind.
Oh, it does. Even now,
Yeah.
listening to you after already having listened to it, it just,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a lot. It also is reminding me, at one point you said how God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I
Mhm.
remember the first time just feeling like I was beginning to understand that, like the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph is the same God of today, and trying
Yeah.
to break that down in my brain, knowing that he's outside of time, but I'm not. That's a
Yeah.
lot for your brain to try to process.
Well, yeah, and I mean, you working with students for so long, like that's got to even just like part of it melts out of the side of their ear a little bit. Like, whoa, whoa,
Hmm.
whoa! I'm just trying to figure out how to get through seventh grade. Like, let
Yep.
alone like. So, have you found that as you try to talk about these really dense theological topics with junior hires or high school, whoever you're speaking with, has it been helpful to you to be able to comprehend that even more? Like to be able to
Oh, yes,
grasp it? Yeah.
absolutely. I think, a lot of us can get stuck where we're at. Like the next big thing in our life is just so big. It's just so
Yes.
big to us. And so if you're 13 and
Hmm.
eighth grade is coming and graduation is coming to you, that is like just such an overwhelming thing for you and maybe just where you're at. And I remember one time I was in a discipleship group
Hmm.
and the leader had rolled out this piece of toilet paper to both ends of the room and put these tiny little like dots in the middle, like this is the span of your life. And life has been that far to one side, life has gone the other far to the other side. God is over all time. He's outside of that and
Yeah.
he's looking in on it, but you're just in here. And I'm like, I'm that small,
Yeah.
so the idea that God is so great, but in his greatness, he has created us and allowed
Yeah.
us to have and do life. But yeah, I mean, we can really get stuck with what is big to us is so big
Yeah.
when maybe the greatness is really the gospel and what God has to offer and
Yeah.
not just me making it through the end of this year.
Right.
While both matter, it's a different perspective, I think.
Yeah, totally. And we look at the world that we're in right now that is in constant change. Like constant change. Every time you turn on your Instagram, it's something
Mhm.
new, and what was exciting now is not exciting anymore. And then you just look at how somebody has little, it used to be 15 minutes of fame and now it's like 15 seconds of fame because it just moves
Yes.
that quickly. And I think that well, I don't think, I know that becomes super overwhelming to people, because ultimately what it's doing is it's saying like nothing's ever secure, nothing's ever
Mhm.
going to stay the same. But to know that God is the same, I think there's a lot of security in that, which is why I love the fact that He calls Himself the Rock, right?
Yeah.
That we can stand on that rock. It's not like shifting sand, as Jesus would say, like the rock of who we are. And so for the world that we live in, to know that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Um, is going to be really, I think, a sense of relief to us, because that we can grab
Mhm.
onto that and know it's not going to go anywhere. even if we don't necessarily agree or like everything that God says, to know that he's steadfast and not going to move from that position or waver from that is actually a source of strength for us.
Oh, yeah.
And for those of us that follow God, I think it allows us to be able to say, okay, I can trust it. It's not moving. It's not this.
Hmm.
It's not this thing that's going to fluctuate. I can trust it. I'm going to believe in it. I'm going to rig my entire life to it because it's not going
Oh,
to
yeah.
move.
It just screams hope to me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's the word. That's the word.
Yeah, it screams hope. You went on to say, or you read through Romans 1:19 through 20, since what may be known, made about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. You went on to unpack that a little bit more, but maybe we can talk about how has God made his truth plain to us.
Well, and there's a question that you and I have heard how many different times, like, well, what happens about the people that have never heard about Jesus and these
Yep.
like and there's always like that kind of that gotcha moment that people want to have, like, yeah, but
Hmm.
what about that? And so it's what Paul is saying here is that God, in his graciousness, made his creation in such a way that it's obvious, like who he is, or he would want you to see it as obvious. And so if you just like even like a small, like, consider our little Milky Way galaxy that's engulfed inside of other galaxies, and this infinite amount of stars, and we're sending things to Mars, and we think, well, that's amazing. That's just like the tip of the iceberg. And so that's just to think that complexity is God's fingerprint is amazing to think. I mean, and then I just was thinking the other day about like DNA in our body,
Hmm.
and those four proteins that you have of adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine that combine together to create the actual intricacies of what makes us, our fingers, our toes, our eyes, or everything, and just this certain combination, they go in a certain way, and that DNA is in a double helix, and a double helix is perfectly formed to be able to replicate those things, and without a double helix, it wouldn't happen as quickly, and just this mind-blowing stuff that you have. And then you think about when people actually started to go through the Human Genome Project and to kind of map out all the different genes, all the different AGTCs that are on that DNA helix, and how that all worked. And then know that Dr. Francis Collins, one of the main researchers on that, was an atheist going into that project. And by
Hmm.
the time he was done mapping the human genome, he's like, I got to be a Christian, because God was so evident in just looking at the science and the research that was there. It's just like mind blowing that that's right there in front of us for God, that God has given us. And then you could look at the complexity of the eye, or any kind of different thing. And then I was reading the other day about the morpho butterfly. I know you probably done a lot of research on the morpho butterfly. You look like a butterfly yeah.
Yeah.
So if you've ever seen, they got blue wings,
Okay.
and they're kind of almost translucent. They're in Central America, South America, and in Mexico somewhere. But the way that it's created is that when the light hits it, when they're flapping, they almost look like they're invisible, like they kind of morph
Ooh.
into different things. And we now are using the wings of those butterflies to work on like different ways of thermo imaging on things in our, like, that we're creating now. But we're using the butterfly as the information that we're gaining to be able to understand that. And that comes from a creator that loves us. And so, gosh, we could see so many different ways that God is like, man, look at the butterflies, look
Yes.
at the sun, look at the ocean. Like, I'm everywhere. And so for me, that gives us less and less excuse to say, well, I didn't know. There's no way. So
Hmm.
unless you're completely ignorant to everything that's around you, or just are so hardened in your heart to say, it could have happened accidentally, with enough, molecules bumping in, you can get a morpho butterfly that creates blue wings, that has transparency, that'd be able to, let's just be honest. Like, it takes more faith to believe that than it does to believe that there's a God in the universe that loves us and creates us.
Oh,
And so
yeah.
that's why I say, like, I look at what Paul says and like, dude, I get it. Like, I look all around it. And then if you even consider just small things like joy, like how do you quantify joy, or how do you qualify love? Like, where are those things, and where do those come from? And they have to come from something greater than us, because they are intrinsically inside all of us. And we know when we have it, but
Hmm.
it's the beauty of God just in all creation. I mean, what do you think about that when you hear about things like that?
Yeah. The DNA thing, it always blows my mind. Years ago, I think I was at maybe Passion, and Louis Giglio did a whole thing with if the earth was the size of a golf ball, but he
Yeah.
just talks about like the greatness of God and him as creator. But then it was also ringing in my brain, in another life, you were not a pastor.
Oh,
What was
yeah.
your job before? being a
Yeah.
pastor?
Yeah. Well, this will make my mom happy because I actually get to earn my degree here. So my undergrad is in biology and exercise physiology.
Okay.
So all this stuff that geeks me out. I really love to look at some of that stuff. So
Well, yeah, I was just thinking that actually plays so much into you pastoring, get to understand the creation side of that.
yeah.
And just the idea that an atheist investigated it and was digging in and was so blown away that said, this has to point to a creator.
Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Francis Collins, you can look it up. He's a Christian like none other, but he was a staunch atheist. He was a geneticist. He went in the project very cold, like, oh, I'm gonna just whatever do this thing. And at the end of it, he's like, there's no other way. Like there's no, and then you could look at other things like Lee Strobel
Yeah,
when he went
case
through.
for a creator.
Yeah, Case for a Creator.
Or Case for Christ also. He did both. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Case for Creator is really, really good too. But yeah, this staunch atheist that went into it with this arrogance of like, I'm going to disprove God, and God's just like, well, you could try, but it's right in front of you. And so I really think that that's what Paul is trying to say. Guys, it's right in front of you. And God did that so that we would be without excuse, he would say.
Oh, yeah. It even reminds me of your friend we've had speak here before who's authored a couple books, Caleb Kaltenbach. He said as a high school student, he went to disprove Christianity at a Bible study, and he ended up getting saved. And now I don't know, he's got like 3 or 4 books out there, and God has changed him. He's a pastor. He's a communicator.
Oh, yeah. If you have yet to investigate or read any of Caleb Kaltenbach's work, definitely do that. But yeah, he did that. Yeah, he's like, I'm just going to go prove these guys wrong. And he actually had this plan where he's going to blow them up publicly in the middle of the meeting and stuff.
Yeah,
and,
roast them so
roast
hard.
them. And
Yeah.
next thing he knows, he's like, I want what you've got. So
Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, we've all grown up in a different context, so I think we all have a different lens looking at this. But I think what's great is it's the same God that we're all looking at.
Yeah.
And like you said earlier, he has not changed through the test of time. So the foundation is firm and the same.
Yeah, so important. Yeah, absolutely.
You went on later in your message to say we live in a world where we would rather ignore God than submit to him as a result of our hearts darkened. You mentioned that after reading Romans 1:21 through 23.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can share a little bit more about that concept.
Well, yeah, just when we were just saying that God has put everything in front of us that makes it so obvious, but yet we will very quickly create these justifications, or it could have been this, or we just ignore him. We ignore him because it's just easier to do that. Because it's easier to think that all there is what's in front of me, or all there is what I can do, or what I could create, or what I could, and we just we're just selfish and individualistic. We just want what we want. And so if something deviates from that, or it requires us to have the F word, the faith word involved with it, we just have a hard time putting our minds around that because we've been so ingrained to believe that you need to be able to prove whatever you're believing in, like without a shadow of a doubt. This idea of faith just seems a little silly. But then you consider, man, we have faith in our lives all the time. Like every day, like when we come to the stop sign at the 4-way stop, we have faith that those guys are going to stop on either side of us, right? We have faith that when we sit down in the chair, it's going to hold our weight, unless we hit the wrong button and we shoot to the bottom. But you never know, right?
Yeah.
So, but like we have faith. So we live in a world that would rather ignore God, because if you ignore him, then he doesn't become as real. But then if he's real, then we have to submit to him, because if he's real, then what he says is real. And so we don't like that submission part. We don't want to have anybody tell us what to do. And so we say, you know what, I'm just going to push you away. And when we do that, our hearts become darkened and deadened, because we're no longer living. We're no longer connected to the vine, as Jesus would say, right? I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who are connected to me have life, right? That's what we need to have. And God is saying, if you do that, which you can, I give you free will, you can move away from me, but you're just slowly dying. You're slowly moving away from what is obviously in front of you, what is obviously true. And I think that that's what Paul is trying to kind of navigate through, is like, hey, God's created this world in a way that I'm all around you. Don't deaden your hearts to it. Believe and lean into it.
Yeah, the idea of wanting creation more than the creator, which I think is so easy to do when we're not intentional, when we're not maybe even planning our day and our time of how we spend it. Just like that, we're diving into everything that creation has to offer and forgetting who is the giver of all of that. Yeah.
Well, even like we know people that have gone the other route with creation, where they worship creation, like that, and they're hugging trees, or like life comes from the rocks, and like all this kind of stuff, And I grew up in South Dakota, up in the 4.5 miles up in the mountains of the Black Hills of South Dakota, and so I had trees and everything around it. It was just beautiful. But the problem is that when we start to get so fixated on the creation, and believe that it terminates on itself, that it's beautiful because it's beautiful, and we take out the part that it's beautiful because something created it.
Yeah.
We miss out on the whole thing. It's like enjoying the good steak at Smith and Walensky's and just saying, wow, I'm just so glad this meat created itself and it just happened to be on the plate, and cocoa and coffee. That's amazing that just happened. As opposed to this like super good chef in the back that's like, hang on, like I'm actually the one that like did that. And then you go even further back. Well, I wouldn't have the steak if I didn't have the cow. And if I didn't have the cow, I wouldn't be able to have the steak. And then who created the cow? Well, God created the cow. So it all comes back to
Who
God.
created the chef? Who created the
Yeah,
recipe?
right, yeah. So,
Oh,
so
yeah.
it's so easy to worship creation because it's right there in front of us. It's the things you can touch, taste, and feel, and but you can't do those things with the creator because he's not physically in front of us, but he is by what he's created for us.
So how would someone fight that? What would somebody do to be intentional to not unintentionally bow down to creation and make sure they're bowing down only to the one true creator?
Well, you might say, well, gosh, it's kind of hard, isn't it? Because I would love to be able to because I want to be able to express whatever I'm feeling to someone or something that can receive that in front of them. But I would actually go back to what Rick Warren said in his book, In Purpose-Driven Life, the very first word, where it says it's not about me. Like if you realize, like maybe this whole thing isn't about me, that maybe there's something beyond, and keep asking those questions of why, of like, okay, well, why is that? Why is El Capitan there at this time? Why are these trees? Why is DNA created the way it is? And if you start to unpack that, you're going to slowly get yourself back to this idea that there's a creator, that this comes from someone that loved us, and it was designed intentionally and had love created behind it, and it brings you back to God. So if we just simply say, it's not all about me, like there has to be something else, I think that helps us to get past that selfish state. So, I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it happens on accident. I don't think much good stuff does. It's always that attention,
No.
the intentionality behind it. I like what you said about Rick Warren, about it's not about us. But I think it's that shift of perspective of seeing just beyond what's right in front of me.
Yeah.
Looking from the bigger scope out. And if we're looking at all of creation, I'm one of the beings that's been created in creation, but
Yeah.
I'm not the being. I'm
Yeah.
not the one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and we're watching the Olympics right now because we love yours gymnastics. Am I right? Are you just
obsessed with most of it.
Obsessed with? Is there anything you're not obsessed with?
Yeah, I haven't watched any judo.
Oh, you're missing out.
I also don't super know what judo is, so I do apologize for those of you guys who grew up doing that. Haven't watched any judo. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I think it's over, so you
Not
missed
gonna
your, you missed your spot. You got 4 more years.
I
so
do
it's okay.
apologize.
Well, but what I get blown away with is that you watch like these divers when they do like all these flips and they go in, there's like negative splash, or Simone Biles when she's doing all the flippity dippities and then she lands on like
On the vault?
on her toe and it's like perfect 12 or whatever. But and you say, but there's this weird part
12.
about us, right? That say, I could do that. You know, like that looks so easy. Like I could do that. Or when I watch a baseball game and I watch somebody field a ground ball and they throw it across the duck, like, oh, that looks easy. And then you try to do the flippity dip and like land on anything other than your back. Like you're like, whoa, that's really hard. So we could look at creation and say, how easy that is. Look at you. And we forget about the complexity of the creator that put that into it. So I don't know.
It's like that meme that's going around that says, again, I'm just like one average person to have to compete next to these Olympic athletes, because I would truly like to understand just how amazing and miraculous what they're doing is.
Yeah. Which is, I think, God's creation. You know, that to understand how miraculous this truly is, you need to know the creator, the one that actually did it. So.
Oh, yeah. So at some point, Paul moves on around verse 24 and talks about how, therefore, God gave them over, people diving into their sinful desires rather than kind of making that U-turn and going towards God, just choosing to dive full in. And Paul gives, this big list kind of what that looks like. I know you unpacked that.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to read through the list, if we want to talk about, but what does that mean? God gave them over, and then people choosing to live in what they've been given over to rather than choosing Christ.
Yeah. Well, before this, verse 24, there was 2 all those that we had kind of walked through.
Yes.
So Paul was very specific to say, although they knew what was right, and although they thought they knew that they were wise, As a result, instead, they chose the opposite. And so, again, God is giving us free will to be able to choose these things. And although they knew who God was, and although they thought that they were wise, they chose to turn from God and they choose to do foolish things, is what Scripture says. But that's the ahead of that, and then the therefore comes.
Yeah.
So we have the opportunity to choose our all those in our lives. We could choose, we could say, so although I knew who God was, I chose to follow him anyway, even though it was tough. Or although I knew who God was, I chose to turn from him because it was too hard. Like you could choose your although, but the therefore comes as a result of the although. So the therefore, by not choosing God, it says that therefore God gave them over. He's like, okay, as a result of what you chose, I'm going to allow you to choose, and therefore this is what I'm going to give you over to. And he takes his hands. He's like, I love you enough to allow you to choose. And you see that from the beginning of creation. The beginning of creation, I love you enough to be able to let you choose the tree or not to choose the tree. I love you enough to give you that freedom to do it. Because if I didn't do that, you're a robot. You don't actually have true love towards me. You have this manipulation towards me. And that's not what I want. Like, I want you to want me. And so what Paul really is just expressing is an extension of the Genesis narrative of God saying, okay, if you don't want me, therefore I'll let you do what you want to. And then he goes on to list all these things. Now, what's interesting is that he takes a little bit more time on the front end to walk through the unnatural relationships that they had gone into in the city of Rome and in the Mediterranean, where women were attracted to women and doing things with women, and men were doing things with men. And we know that today as homosexuality. And so he goes on for several verses of that to really unpack that.
Yes.
And a lot of us would love. We put there's a, and I'm not sure exactly what verse it is, but there's a word where it says furthermore, right? He says, men committed shameful acts with other men and received themselves the due penalty for their error, period. Now, usually we stop and we don't read any more of that. We don't want to talk about the furthermore. So before we get to the furthermore, let's talk about what was before that. So what Paul is outlining is he's saying, listen, this is what happens when you choose not to follow what I've got for you, what I love for you and I've designed for you. And he says, these are things that are outside of my will. And as we look at homosexuality and we read through the Bible, we clearly see that God is designed for a man to be with a woman and a woman to be with a man. And that comes all the way back to the Genesis narrative. And again, if we use this as a derivative of that, we see that taking place. But what we as Christians, especially Christians that are very like hardcore, we want to stop there and we want to beat that down and we don't want to move past that. And the reality is that there is a furthermore. Yep. That although those are things that are outside of God's design, he says there's a lot of other things too. And the furthermores are so important. He talks about lying. He talks about wickedness, evil, greed, depravity, envy, murder, strife, malice, gossip, slander, God haters, insolence, arrogance, boastfulness, disobedience, confusion, infidelity, and hate. Like he talks about a whole lot of other things. And so we need to make sure that we're understanding that what God is demonstrating to us, what Paul is demonstrating is that all sin, all things that are apart from God's design are things that he's turning us over to and that ultimately are going to lead us away from life. He's saying, I want you to live life to the full. But in order for you to do that, you need to trust me. You need to love me. You need to believe that I am the God that is yesterday, today, and forevermore. Like, I'm not moving. I love you that much for that never to change. And so I think what's really important for us to remember is that although Paul spends an extensive time about that, really maybe more words per se than the others, he's very quickly to talk that the avalanche goes very quickly of other things that are in our world, in our lives that keep us from God just as much as those other things do as well. So I always want to caution people that we don't just read scripture as the fortune cookie verses, where we just kind of pick and choose things that we like or don't like or land on it. We need context. We need the total scope of it, which is why we're going through Romans the way that we are, that we're not just cherry picking things here or there, but to be able to understand it fully. And so that I think is really important for us to consider as we walk through this.
Oh yeah, and not stopping when it becomes inconvenient for us, but saying, okay, I'm all in on trusting what God has, and that might mean I'm in on trusting that he knows better than I know.
Yeah.
Okay, so Brian, this leads me to ask something that I'm wondering if the listeners and myself are all wondering maybe together.
Okay.
Why in Romans, in the section of in chapter 1, verse 24 through 31, why is Paul camping out so heavily in the first half of that when he's talking about sin against the body, and then the furthermores he doesn't take as much time to unpack those?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually, I think it helps us to frame a little bit about Paul's thought process through this. And I really think it's culturally, I think it's super important for us to think about too, because I don't think that we'll make this connection. So let's remember this. Let's remember that Paul is writing this from Corinth. Okay, so he's in Corinth writing this to Rome. Corinth is just a mess, like a mess of things. And so we could kind of, and we had said this last week, that a little bit, it can't help but bleed a little bit of his Corinth experience into Rome, saying, boy, I hope what's happening in Corinth doesn't happen in Rome too. But he's really speaking about a universal truth. Because in 1 Corinthians, again, remembering, writing in Corinthians to Rome, he's also writing about Corinthians. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he says, all other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. So Paul is basically saying, he's saying there is something that all sin is sin. Like sin all separates us from God, but there is something intrinsically different about a sexual sin that we do against our body. And then he really explains why in verse 19, because he says, our body is a temple, he says. He would go on later to say, honor God with your body. So what Paul is saying is that, yes, the reason this is so important is because he wants you to value what God has given you so much, and to value the things that God has designed for you to be able to have with one woman and one man, and to see that as a beautiful thing for us to grab onto and to hold on to, because it really brings us our best life. It really brings the purity of what God would want for us in our life. And so Paul is saying he spends a little bit more time there because he knows the impact that's going to have on us. And my goodness, if we can be just honest with ourselves, the sexual sin that's in our world right now is destroying us. And can I also say that it's not just about homosexuality, it's all sexual sin. So let's just clear the air that it's everything that's out there. Just because we might want to use this one little niche aspect of God's word, but it's everything. That's why the furthermore is so important. That Paul just doesn't stop there, that he goes on to all those things, those other things that you could say are outside the body, again, like lies and murder and strife and all that. But he wants to make sure that he camps out. He's being consistent in the fact that he says, hey, the sins that happen, sexual sins that happen in our life happen like inside our bodies that are to be God's temple. And we should be very mindful of that as we go through it. So that's why he spends the time on it. That's why I believe is so important, is for us to really comprehend that. But we cannot ever forget the furthermores, because everybody, me included, driving to work today, probably did it myself, screwed up on one of these. And that's why we need the gospel of Jesus. Everybody needs that for every sin they commit.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's where you really left us at the end of your message, was with the choice of, we can embrace the love and grace of Jesus in our life to live a new life free of sin, or we can continue down the road that leads to destruction and the eventual wrath of God. And that the choice lies in our hands.
Yeah, it does. We are not robots. Again, we have choice. We have the opportunity to be able to choose. And as I say it in a sentence, as I said this week, without God's wrath, we could not fully appreciate his love. We just can't, the totality of that we get a chance to choose what side of God's wrath we want to be on.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we hope you guys are following along with your walk this week, digging more into Romans 1. Thanks for listening to the 99 this week. And Brian, thanks for helping us understand Romans a bit better. Can I get a couple of sentences of the direction you're headed next week as we dive back into Romans?
You got it, Heather. I'm just going to say this. It involves basketball and me dunking.
Perfect.
Yes, maybe hanging on the rim, not sure. Yeah, it's going to be super fun. But we're going to be talking about God's righteousness. We're going to be talking about the law. We're going to be talking about how does this all factor in? Because whether we like it or not, our world, we actually like checklists. We like things to do. I'm a type A plus person. And so if there was a way to say, if we did this, this, and this, that God would be happy, a lot of people would say, man, I'm down. And then we look at the law in the Old Testament, we're like, well, maybe that's a checklist if I do this, this, and this. And then we realize that Jesus came to say, it's actually more complex than that. You need me in this whole mess of things. So excited to unpack that and continue in Romans chapter 3. And you can start to read ahead. No one's going to, look bad at you if you do. But we're excited about what next week's going. Make sure you're here. Make sure you bring your study guide. Make sure you turn in the 99. A lot of great ways for you to connect with us through this series.
Oh, yeah. We hope you join us online or on campus next week. Bring your one. Watch Brian pursue his Olympic dreams.
Let's go.
And learn about moral relativism. See you next week. Thank you for joining us today for the 99 podcast. We hope to see you next weekend at Crossroads on campus or online for one of our 4 services. To view our service times, be sure to check out our website at crossroadsgrace.org.